Welcome to the Centre for Geopolitics from Cambridge University in the UK. Thank you for joining us for our latest webinar, An American Nightmare, What Will a Contested Election Mean for the World? It's less than a month till the upcoming US presidential election. Already it's been a campaign like no other, taking place under the shadow of a pandemic, which has in recent days even landed President Donald Trump in hospital and spread through the West Wing of the White House. But even without that, it's been dramatic and fractious. Unprecedented polarization, allegations of voter fraud, voter suppression, and foreign interference, and both sides already warming up for legal challenges. The polls are not that far apart, and Mr. Trump in particular has left open the possibility he may not accept the result if he doesn't win outright. So if the results are contested and the US falls into a sustained political paralysis, what are the likely ramifications for the rest of the world? What might this mean not just for the United States, but for the entire world? It's a rich topic for the latest nightmare scenario discussion from the Centre for Geopolitics. I'm Bridget Kendall, former BBC diplomatic correspondent and now master of Peterhouse here in Cambridge. I'll be your chair for this event, and I'm really delighted to be joined by three panelists. Andrew Preston is Professor of American History here at Cambridge University. Lawrence Douglas is Professor of Law, Jurisprudence and Social Thought at Amherst College in the United States, and author of Will He Go? Trump and the Looming Electoral Meltdown in 2020. And Baroness Arminka Hellich is life member of the House of Lords here in the UK and a noted foreign policy expert. She sits on the UK International Relations and Defence Committee and is was Senior Special Advisor to the Foreign Secretary from 2010 to 2014. Arminka's originally from Bosnia, so she comes with plenty of her own experience of what can happen when politics turns into a nightmare. Before we hear from the panelists, do remember, if you're in the audience, that we are very keen to hear from you too, and you can ask questions if you'd like to. Your microphones and cameras are off, so you can send your questions through the Q&A option on the screen. Give your name and affiliation and where you're from, and say if your question's for a particular person, do say that. And just to add that this is being live streamed and you'll find a recording up later on the Centre for Geopolitics website. So let's get going. And I'd like to start with you, if I may, Lawrence, to set the scene, to give us a brief overview, if you would, of how the nightmare scenario of a contested election might play out, say between November the 3rd, when the election takes place, and January the 20th. Just to give us a brief overview.
Right, happy to do so. So thanks so much for the kind invitation, and it's a pleasure to be talking with you here. It's an early afternoon for me. And so maybe we should just pay attention to a couple of dates. So you already mentioned November 3rd, that's the day, that's election day. But of course, in this unusual election season, we need to bear in mind the fact that tens of millions of Americans will not be voting in person on that day, but rather will be casting a vote by mail-in ballots. The other kind of bookend date that you mentioned is January 20th, and by the terms of the US Constitution, as of noon on January 20th, President Trump's term of office ends unless he's being reelected. And so those are kind of two important bookend dates. There are a couple of other dates for us to bear in mind if we're trying to see how things could go very, very sideways in this election season. One other critical date is December 8th. And I think that's a date that's on very few people's radar. But that is the day which, according to a law that was passed by Congress in 1887 called the Electoral Count Act, in this election season, on December 8th is the day by which states really need to figure out who has carried their state. Because once the state figures out who has won the popular vote within the state, they can then notify the electors of the winning candidate that they will be going to the state capitol, and this will happen on December 14th, and actually cast their electoral college votes for the winner. Those votes will then be sent on to Congress, very quaintly, by certified mail. And come January 6th, which is the next, I think, really critical date we need to pay attention to. On January 6th, Congress, in a joint session, will open these electoral certificates count them up, and declare a winner. And that's only when we actually have a president-elect. So what can go wrong between November 3rd and January 20th? Well, I think we've already seen a pretty clear strategy that President Trump has outlined. And the strategy seems to be something along the lines as this. The mail-in ballots are not going to be counted until days or even weeks after the election, at least in the critical swing states. It just so happens that the key swing states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania do not even permit election officials to begin counting mail-in ballots until election day itself. So what we can imagine happening is, because we know the mail-in ballots are going to break heavily for Biden, that is, a recent poll indicated about 60% of Biden voters are going to vote by mail-in ballot in comparison to about 20% of Trump voters. We can imagine that on November 3rd, Trump has a lead, and that he tries to then leverage this lead into a claim that he has been reelected. And that as the mail-in ballots start to be counted, and as that lead erodes, Trump basically declares that the erosion of his lead is a confirmation of everything that he's been predicting for the last several months, namely that the mail-in ballots have been irretrievably contaminated by fraud, and we cannot trust the mail-in ballot results. Now, could that strategy work? That is, if the strategy of leveraging his lead on November 3rd into a claim of victory and basically a rejection of all the mail-in ballots that then break for Biden's, And I think the answer is it could work. It could work under the following circumstances. If it is the case that the count of mail-in ballots becomes delayed, let's say by harmless human error, by the sheer volume of ballots to be counted, by the fact that, who knows, a fresh outbreak of COVID in key swing states means that election officials are understaffed for the purposes of sorting them out. Or, for example, the count of these ballots becomes the subject of prolonged litigation. You could imagine some genuine confusion arising as to who has carried these key swing states, with the overall election hanging in the balance. And what could happen is, if the count is so delayed that it starts pushing against this December 8th date that I mentioned, you could imagine that, that states reach different conclusions as to who has won their state. And the reason, again, I need to go back to Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, is they all have the same political profile, which makes for a really potentially dangerous situation, in that they all have Republican-controlled legislatures and Democratic governors. And if the count starts to push against this December 8th date, you could imagine the Republican legislators recognizing Trump as having carried the states, the Democratic governors recognizing Biden as having carried the states. Come January 6th, when Congress has to count the electoral certificates, Congress is confronted with competing electoral certificates from these key swing states, with the overall election hanging in the balance. And that, I'm afraid, is a nightmare scenario.
Okay. Just one follow-up to that. That's very clear. Thanks so much, Lawrence. I mentioned it in my introduction, this October surprise, if you like, that President Trump himself got coronavirus, and it swept through the West Wing. Does this complicate the scenario, do you think, or does it simplify it? Does it change anything?
Well, I mean, one thing that is obviously, the coronavirus has done two things. It has made Trump into a far more vulnerable candidate because of the epic failure of leadership on the part of the president to deal with this health crisis. And secondly, I would say that it has also made him into a more dangerous candidate. Because all along, if you even go back to 2016, his attacks on the integrity of the electoral system, there's nothing new about them. But one of the things that Corona, of course, has done, it has created this somewhat different form by which Americans will be going to the ballots. And typically we watch the results on November 3rd in much the way that you probably watch Champions League final, or we watch the Super Bowl. We expect by the time we go to sleep that we know who the next president is. And given the fact that we're voting in a time of pandemic, it's very unlikely that we will know the results on November 3rd itself. It's not unlikely that we won't know the results for several days or even weeks afterwards. And I think that unfortunately just fits in the script of a president who is willing to engage in the kind of constitutional brinkmanship that Trump appears willing to engage in.
Okay, well, we'll probably come back to that, but let's bring in Andrew here as a historian to see what historical lessons there are that might be relevant when we're looking at this. We're particularly looking at the potential contested, not just contested elections in the US per se, but contested elections which had a geopolitical resonance. Is there anything in the past that we should look at to learn from, either because it's very different now or because it has lessons for us that are a reflection of what's happening today? An echo.
Thanks, Bridget. That's a very good question. I'm not sure there's an answer because I don't think there are any good parallels to what we have today. There have been contested elections in the past before, of course, but I do think for a variety of reasons, some of which Lawrence just outlined, we're in a really unusual, you could say unique, unprecedented situation. The contested elections of the 19th century, I don't think have any relevance in foreign policy terms, in geopolitical terms, because the United States wasn't a major power in 1800, 1824, or 1876. And when you think about the contested elections, at least the ones I think about in the 20th and early 21st century, they did happen when the United States was a world power, was a superpower. They did happen in a way that the election was extremely contested and may have left the United States open to vulnerabilities or maybe provided enemies with advantages abroad. And nothing really happened, at least nothing happened in relation to the election. So 1948 was contested because Harry Truman, everyone thought he was going to lose. He ended up winning. I'm sure if that scenario happened today, it would be played out in the courts for a long time. And that was, just as the Cold War is coming into place. That's during the Berlin blockade and the airlift. It's during all sorts of extremely tense moments in the Cold War, and nothing really happened there. 1960, of course, was contested. Again, if it happened today, I'm sure Richard Nixon would have contested it and wouldn't have conceded, for the good of the country, for the good of American foreign policy. He thought, who knows who would have won that contestation. But again, at a very, very sensitive moment in the Cold War, right when the Cold War was coming out of a brief period of détente in the 1950s and entering into what historians call another Cold War, or the crisis years of the Cold War, this moment, including the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, where things were very, very sensitive. And again, there's no evidence, or very little evidence, to show that foreign actors tried to take advantage of the situation. And as far as I know, the same is true for 2000. So I'm not sure.
Hang on, 2000, the Cold War was over.
No, the Cold War was over, right? But I mean, in terms of foreign policy, I mean, in terms of, sorry, you're absolutely right about the Cold War, but in terms of foreign actors trying to take advantage of the situation by doing something that they know the United States would oppose them doing, and thinking the U.S. would be frozen or would be in chaos, or there'd be paralysis in the chain of command. And that didn't happen in 2000. And I'd say that one of the reasons I've been thinking of why this is so different is that we're expecting this election to be contested. Not just close, but we're expecting it to be contested. It's already the most litigated election in presidential history. And so now what might be different now is that foreign actors can plan in advance, as it were, because they kind of know that there's going to be paralysis. They know that there's going to be chaos. And then they know that the US might be in a really bad place for 5 or 6 weeks. So that's another reason why now I think we're just on new terrain.
Just one little follow-up for 2000. I mean, you're implying that maybe in 1948 and 1960, the world seemed too dangerous for the US to be seen to be vulnerable and arguing with itself at this critical time. So do you think there was anything which gave Al Gore pause for thought about in the world? I mean, it was before 9/11, wasn't it? It was, if you like, quite a benign time in the world.
Absolutely, I think that's right, and I think that's another reason why 2000 doesn't really give us a good model when it comes to geopolitics, when it comes to foreign policy.
Okay, well, the title of this session is about nightmares, so let's hear some nightmares. And I'm going to ask you what your worst nightmares are, because I'm sure you have lots of nightmares about this prospect that lies ahead of us. Minka, can I start with you?
Yes, thank you very much, and good evening, everyone, or good morning. I'm very conscious of what I have just heard, that it has in a way confirmed my worst nightmares, because when you're observing the United States from outside, you think somehow that maybe you are making it too much of a big deal. Maybe there is a system out there that it's going to really make it all fine, and we're all going to wake up on the 4th of November and it's all going to be clear. And it comes as a bit of a surprise and as a bit of a shock to us, the observers, and all those who are who care about the United States. And I just want to put it into sort of a context of what orderly, stable, strong, internationalist United States means for people like me, people who have experienced war and who have experienced lack or active United States in the Western Balkans, where I was born. It is a country that really sets it's a reference point. It's a trendsetter. It's a country that you look up to. It's a country that formulates the ideal scenario of how peaceful transition of power is undertaken. And to see the United States in a moment of paralysis, or to hear that the expectation is that the election is going to be contested, it comes as a shock and comes as a moment when things aren't normal anymore, and that's something that you have to face up to. And in terms of the worst case scenario, and I stand here and I will say that their probability is probably quite small, but there is some, is I would look in what might happen on international scene, not only how other actors might play and how might be preparing for a moment where the US is kind of too busy with itself and inward looking. And here I think about two geopolitical rivals to the United States, it's Russia and China. But I will leave that on the side for a bit. And I think of what might President Trump do if he is looking to be seen as a man of power and a man who has the ability not only to impact and influence what's happening at home, but also abroad, whether there is a foreign policy adventure that he might find himself attracted to and might want to take that step. And you know, there are quite a few candidates, but I think observing the relationship that he has developed in the Gulf, or how close relationship with Israel is under President Trump administration, I don't know whether he would be brazen enough, and he might be, to see Iran as a potentially legitimate target, and something that he might want to do, not only because he's using that moment, but because he wants to show to the world and to the public at home that he's someone that you can not mess about, and someone that you can count on when it comes to defending its allies and etc. And if Iran is in the eyes of many who have poured, I would say, poison in the ear of President Trump, the great Satan, then that is a country to go for. And that would be the worst case scenario for me, because it would put America on a trajectory where it would find itself isolated from its allies. I cannot see anyone in Europe, I cannot see even the United Kingdom government to be standing there shoulder to shoulder with the United States, and country might find itself isolated. But on top of that, it could find that we finally have that final break between the United States and Europe. And I would consider that to be a major geopolitical upset. And I know that the relations haven't been the strongest over the last 3-4 years. It's not what we used to, but to have that final break would be a massive shock to the relations between the United States and Europe, and then Europe trying to find its other allies elsewhere. And that would be strange. as far as the other two are concerned, I strongly believe that Russia has always tried to find and explore uncertainty, whether it would be brazen enough to go and challenge NATO on its eastern borders in the Baltics, I don't know, but it must be a very attractive option for President Putin, and it would challenge NATO when NATO has been put under sort of pressure from the United States, and United States is not being seen as committed to NATO and European security as it used to be. And my third worst case scenario would be, or nightmare scenario would be, China feeling emboldened. China that has emerged as a country that is a serious economic power, second most powerful economy in the world. If it wanted to match its economic power with its military projection of power, then it has got quite a few attractive territories, as they would say, around, and I would say Taiwan being one of them, and potentially even Hong Kong losing those last lines of defense of its autonomy, and China just learning from the recent experience where the silence has been deafening when it comes to the response to what China did or continues to be doing in Hong Kong. So those would be my three American nightmare scenarios.
Well, thank you, Arminka. Let me come to you, Andrew. What are your nightmare scenarios? Do they overlap? You've got different ones?
They very much overlap. Nightmares are worst case scenarios. They're extreme and maybe unlikely and plausible scenarios that play out. That's why we call them nightmares. But I did one of these sessions for the Center for Geopolitics 4 years ago, right before the election. And the nightmare scenario was Donald Trump wins the presidency. And how could that happen? And almost everyone in the room, myself included, thought that it was a nightmare and a worst case scenario that was implausible, but it was not fun to think about, but it was interesting to think about this extremely unlikely event occurring and what would it mean. And the only person there who actually called it was one of the other presenters, who was a pollster from YouGov, and sort of walked us through how it could happen. And guess what happened on election night? It's exactly how he called it. Anyway, so these are worst case scenarios. They may not come to pass. And I hope that's true now in a way that it wasn't 4 years ago when I did this, because the worst case scenario is, of course, a war breaking out because of chaos and paralysis, something broken in the chain of command in Washington. And I don't have anything to add to what's already been said. I fully share those nightmare scenarios that have already been outlined. The only one that I might add to it is that it's not just American adversaries we might worry about, but American allies who have wanted to do things for a long time. And it could be Israel doing something in the Middle East. It could be Japan or South Korea doing something in East Asia. It could be another US ally wanting to do something, knowing that the US has been there saying, don't you dare. And because we've got your back. If there's any uncertainty about American power in very sensitive regions of the world, those allies might see a target of opportunity themselves, not to do something against the United States, but to do something that the US wouldn't support.
So, okay, just to pinpoint on that, what would you see Japan doing?
Well, I'm not sure Japan would launch a war against China, of course, but with over disputed islands, with China, with Russia, that there could be something provocative in terms of seizing an island or firing on Chinese or Russian ships, or sending naval vessels through a certain, through certain sensitive areas, doing something in terms of intelligence. I mean, it doesn't have to be like, an invasion of the PRC or Russia or something like that, but it could be something that's provocative that then has a kind of chain reaction in an environment where there's paralysis in Washington, where there's a bit of uncertainty where the chain of command lies, which I think is maybe some of the very worst case scenarios that Lawrence is outlining for us.
And what about Israel?
Sorry?
What about Israel?
I mean, the obvious one would be attacking Iran, but maybe doing something in Syria, maybe doing something somewhere else in the region, something in Yemen. But I mean, most obviously, it would be an attack against Iran.
Mm. Okay, Lawrence, back to you. What's your nightmare scenario?
Well, I guess I'm supposed to be looking at things domestically. And, I think I've kind of, trotted it out a bit. And I think that the real nightmare scenario is if the election turns on narrow margins in swing states and on the late count of mail-in ballots. That again, it just becomes a recipe for Donald Trump's kind of constitutional brinkmanship. And you know, I think we need to bear in mind a couple of things. You know, Trump carried those key swing states by a total of 78,000 votes in 2016. That's a very small, that's a minuscule margin. Now, again, it's not as minuscule as the 537 votes by which George W. Bush beat Al Gore in Florida when the Supreme Court stopped the recount and handed him the election. But 78,000 votes is a very tight margin. And also just to appreciate it, in the recent primary season, in those same swing states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, about 60,000 mail-in votes were disqualified because of late submission or other technical problems. So the margin of victory that Trump enjoyed in 2016 is largely almost the same as the number of ballots that were disqualified for technical reasons. And that just becomes a recipe for contestation, litigation, and confusion. And I think the thing we need to bear in mind is if the result drags out for a long time, it's not as if we're going to have good faith actors sitting on the sidelines waiting for courts or state officials to figure things out. We're going to have Trump insistently tweeting that he's been reelected and that the Democrats are trying to, in a sense, to stage a coup. We can assume that those claims will be repeated and amplified by his megaphones in the right-wing media. And I think we also need to add to the mix the fact that we can reliably expect foreign adversaries such as Russia to be launching massive disinformation campaigns on social media platforms, basically supporting the claim that the mail-in ballots has been enveloped in fraud, confusion, and corruption. And all that just, it becomes a recipe for in a sense, almost at best stalemate, at worst, genuine chaos that could spill out, really onto the streets of the United States itself.
Okay, yeah, so that was the follow-up question I had, civil unrest. I mean, we think about American history, even quite recent, think about 1968, think about the violence that's been in the last year or the last few years. Do you see this as a real worry that this could become something which is moves out onto the streets?
I certainly think that that's a real worry. I mean, we've seen the way in which the president engages in this kind of dog whistle politics. We saw in the first president, well, maybe it's going to be the only presidential debate, that when the moderator asked him to repudiate white supremacists, he coyly said, "Proud Boys, stand down and stand by." And that signal was it's a very, clear signal that was sent out. And, we know that there's no want of weapons in the United States. There are people who believe passionately that a Biden victory would be the end of, would spell the repeal of the Second Amendment, which is, of course, a preposterous proposition. But I think the possibility of civil unrest is very real. And we've also seen the president willing to overcommit force in the name of law and order.
So a follow-up question to that, and this might depend on timing, I suppose, because as you said, when you get closer to January the 20th, Trump's hourglass is running out.
Yes.
What would happen if we've already had a case of him calling on the National Guard, calling on law enforcement. If they have to make a choice about who to take their orders from, especially if there are parallel results being sent into Congress?
Well, it really depends on how that plays out. I mean, one thing that we should bear in mind is between November 3rd and January 20th, Trump remains commander-in-chief. And so there's no doubt that the military would be following whatever orders or the National Guard or ICE agents Border Patrol, all of them will be following orders from the executive branch, and he remains commander-in-chief until January 20th. We should also bear in mind that he has not yet used federal troops. He expressed a willingness to do so all the way back in June. That would really require invoking this Insurrection Act of 1807, which he has not yet done, but it is possible to imagine him doing that if the magnitude of unrest on the streets becomes great enough. If it is the case that Biden has been, let's say, duly inaugurated on January 20th, then I don't really see a problem at all. I mean, he's now the commander-in-chief, and Trump at this point is a civilian and would be a trespasser in the White House. And, to be honest, of the kind of nightmare scenarios I have, I really don't imagine we're going to need to see Donald Trump frog marched out of the White House by members of the military. But again, the real danger is the kind of confusion that could really extend out through January and potentially past January 20th. And that could be an incredibly destabilizing issue. If, for example, in the worst of all nightmares, let's say you have these parallel inaugural ceremonies that take place. So Biden is inaugurated by John Roberts, and who knows, Clarence Thomas inaugurates Donald Trump. That's a real nightmare scenario, and I really do hope that the country doesn't confront anything like that. Though, as Andrew suggested, it came close to situations like that back in 1876.
So we've had quite a few questions here. That a lot of them relate to the internal situation, and I'll come back to you on that, Lawrence. But just to pick up something which Armenka said, and ask you, Andrew, this question of Trump creating an adventure to rally forces around him to create unity. Do you see that as an option? Because I mean, the scenario that Lawrence is painting is of a Trump who's much more focused on what's going on internally and the message he might need to give to create a certain mood inside America. So do you think that he would look outside as well?
Is this for me?
Yeah, for you, Andrew.
Yeah, I think that's, unfortunately, I think that is actually plausible. I think that's one of the more plausible nightmare scenarios, because he will be commander-in-chief until January 20th, no matter what happens. And his powers as commander-in-chief, executive war powers, are, they theoretically have constitutional checks, but really Congress has abdicated those powers for a long time. And I just can't see this Congress getting its act together in order to stop him doing what it would take in order to, I think it's really just their power over the purse, over appropriations that would really, or impeachment. And those two things, just I can't see this Congress doing. So he can more or less do whatever he wants, assuming the military will obey his orders. So I think it is a plausible scenario. It would be easy to do in the sense that it would just require him putting together or putting into motion contingency plans that already exist. I mean, the Pentagon has contingency plans for all sorts of contingencies for all sorts of countries. And a lot of these would have been war gamed. And so it could actually be really easy. And there's this is contentious a little bit, but there is at least the idea of historical precedent for it with Bill Clinton during his troubles in 1999 in the bombing of Kosovo. And this is where the whole
scenario.
Right, exactly, the whole kind of wag the dog scenario emerges. And there's some suggestive circumstantial evidence that that's what was on Clinton's mind, but just the fact that people think that he did that, it's there, maybe there for Trump's taking.
What do you think, Lawrence, about that? Or do you think he would just want to focus on the internal messaging?
I think a lot of it is brand for him. And obviously the brand is about strength. And one thing that I think we can say about Trump so far is he's, I think, been at times reckless in the use of force, because nothing is ever thought through by him. At the other hand, he hasn't yet proven himself a warmonger. That is, if there's anything, kind of remotely positive to say about him, he seems to be quite reluctant to get the United States bogged down in a military dispute. But I could certainly imagine, as Andrew points out, I could imagine this kind of symbolic demonstration of force, kind of a single hit kind of response, and which would kind of be a very reckless use of military force. But I think he'd be very wary, in part because of the message that he's told his base about committing American troops in any kind of aggressive fashion. I think he'd be very, very reluctant to do that, because that also does not really agree with his messaging.
We'll come back to the internal US in a moment. We've got quite a few questions on that, but there's a question come through which is a good one for you, Arminka. This is from Richard Dickinson, who's in political science department here in Cambridge, a master's student in international relations. Could the nightmare scenario include more military conflict, perhaps proxy, between Russia and Turkey, for example, in Libya, Syria, or the Caucasus? We're looking at what's going on in Nagorno-Karabakh at the moment. What do you think?
I don't think, I can't see that there could be a direct conflict between Russia and Turkey, but conflict between the two where they are supporting different proxies is a possibility, and that is already being seen elsewhere in the region, in Syria. It could be in Nagorno-Karabakh, etc. Whether that would present a nightmare scenario, it depends how far it would escalate. I can't see under any scenario a war between Turkey and Russia. Both leaders of both countries have self-preservation as one of the major sort of driving forces behind their policies, even when it comes to defending what they believe, that they're defending the citizens and peoples in the countries where they think that they have some kind of special relationship, whether that is Azerbaijan or whether that is down in Syria. So I don't think that would be a nightmare scenario, not in my books. I think that is something that we have learned to live with, and something that can be contained if you want.
Okay, back into the US, because we've got a question following up on your initial remarks, Lawrence. This is from Robert Wallace, a journalist. Can you walk us through the nightmare scenario if swing state governors disagree with their legislatures? Who wins, or what happens next? And what about the Supreme Court scenario as in the year 2000?
Right, so one thing, so this goes a little bit back to the kind of the dates that we talked about at the very outset. So is it possible that the courts and possibly the Supreme Court will be asked to resolve some kind of dispute about the count of mail-in ballots? And the answer is emphatically yes. Because, for example, one reason I think I mentioned for disqualifying mail-in ballots is if they haven't been submitted in a timely fashion. We've seen the way in which Trump has tried to underfund and understaff the USPS, basically as a way of, in a sense, disenfranchising people, and also a way of creating chaos about the count of mail-in ballots. And so you could certainly imagine, let's say, Biden forces challenging the disqualification of mail-in ballots, which failed to be counted because they simply weren't delivered in time by the USPS. And that kind of litigation could be kicked all the way up to the Supreme Court. If it is the case that that again, things become so murky and the disputes continue up until, let's say, middle of December, and you do have the situation that I described in which, let's say, the legislature concludes that that Trump has carried the state, whereas the governor concludes that Biden has carried the state, and you get these competing electoral certificates landing in Congress's lap when they go into this joint session on January 6th. At that point, I think most constitutional experts would say the Supreme Court has no role whatsoever to play in the resolution of an electoral dispute. That is, once it lands in Congress's lap. According to the Constitution, that's really the responsibility of Congress to figure things out. Now, that, of course, raises the question, can Congress figure out which electoral certificate from these key swing states to recognize? And the answer is, I don't know. And the reason I don't know is because we don't know what Congress is going to look like in January 6th, because another thing we need to bear in mind, it's not the present Congress that will be deciding this. It is the new Congress, which itself will be sworn in on January 3rd, just 3 days earlier. And if that new Congress remains divided as the present one is between Democratic-controlled House, Republican-controlled Senate, then that's a recipe for just complete stalemate. And you only really have 2 weeks for Congress to figure things out. They have until January 6th, until January 20th to figure things out. I don't see how they can do it. And if I can just add, since we're talking catastrophe and nightmares, people, can I just add one more little thing? The other thing to remember is that the actual composition of the new Congress could also be affected by all these delays and litigation.
Yeah, I was just going to ask that.
Votes.
Yeah.
And so these down ballot elections could also be up for grabs and caught up in litigation and contestation. So it might be the case we actually don't know what the composition of the Senate is. So enough nightmare from me.
So, okay, so let's just pause on that for a moment. If you have critical seats in, say, the Senate, in particular, because I think probably most people think that the House will stay Democrat, right?
Absolutely.
But in the Senate, there are critical seats being contested. Where do those get sorted out, those senatorial seats? Any idea?
Well, no, it's not that I don't have an idea. It's that we don't know. Because as opposed to, you know, I mentioned that you have these hard deadlines for the presidential election, December 8th, December 14th, January 6th. You don't have January 20th. You don't have those hard deadlines with regards to Senate and House races. So for example, if you look at the 2018 midterms in the 9th Congressional District in North Carolina, there was an example in which a Republican victory was then later tossed out as a result of all sorts of shenanigans by the Republicans. And how long did it take for the 9th Congressional District to get their new representative? It took almost a year, 10 months. And so it can be a very long and protracted fight when it comes to these down ballot contests.
We've had a different sort of question. See what you make of this, Andrew. It's from Roger Bass, who says, much of the coverage, and at this event too, has appeared to focus on circumstances in which Trump might not accept his losing the election, which is fair enough, really, because he's left that open as a possibility. But he'd like to ask the panel for your thoughts on the possibilities of the opposite scenario, a Democrat refusal. What are your thoughts on that, Andrew?
Well, I mean, Lawrence is the expert on this, on what happens legally, constitutionally. But I think the nightmare scenarios that I talked about in terms of foreign policy don't go away. They're the exact same, because the nightmare is that there's paralysis and chaos in Washington. It's not an implausible nightmare scenario that Trump is winning the Electoral College. It looks like there's going to be a replay of 2016. He's going to squeak out a narrow victory, but we haven't counted all the ballots yet. The mail-in ballots haven't been counted. And there are also contests breaking out over which ballots should be rejected. We've talked about that tonight. And, you know, Joe Biden he's not going to be Al Gore in 2000. He's not going to be, although Al Gore did it after quite a while, but he's not going to be Richard Nixon in 1960. He's not going to be Tom Dewey in 1948 and just go quietly into the good night. They're going to fight this. And Hillary Clinton has told him not to concede. So we get back to the same kind of, in foreign policy terms, we get back to the same kind of nightmare scenarios. Whether we do, and I'd be curious to see whether we get back to the same nightmare scenarios in terms of constitutional law.
Before I bring Lawrence back in on that one, Arminka, have you any thoughts on that?
I have a thought. I mean, you know, I would agree with Andrew. I think if there is the reverse sort of outcome, I almost have a feeling that the Democrats and the Vice President Biden, this is not an ordinary fight. This is an epic fight. There is so much that is at stake that almost, it sounds like a cliche, but every vote matters. And this is not even about one's ambition to be a president or one's political party's ideology. This is about fight for the American soul. So you can't just walk away. You can't just be tired. You can't just be, exercise that level of civility. You have to exercise all the legal means that you have in your arsenal to try, and if it is necessary, prove that it wasn't what it appears to be. And because it's going to be on the knife edge, I expect that everyone is going to go for it. I would expect that Democrats and Vice President Biden would do it through a legal and quite dry and processy way. There is nothing that he can stage that can create a shock, apart from using what tools there are by constitution and institutional powers that are in place that can prove this to be a fight that he has won.
Lawrence, your thoughts on that?
I think I basically agree with what Andrew and Arminka has said already, that, and I also agree that, in a certain sense, at the Democratic National Convention, the Zoomed convention, Barack Obama said pretty clearly, our democracy is at stake here. So the stakes are much higher than they were, let's say, in the year 2000, in that contested election between Al Gore and George W. Bush. And so I do imagine that, that Biden will use every possible means at his disposal for the purposes of trying to reach a clear electoral result. And yet, I do think that there is, again, kind of an asymmetry between, Biden and Trump. I mean, Trump seems to be really willing to kind of ignore basic constitutional norms and processes. And I don't see Biden doing that. I think he will try to use, exactly as Arminka pointed out, I think he'll try to use every possible legal means and constitutional means at his disposal. And I think one thing the Democrats have learned from experience, if you go back to the year 2000, not only did Gore concede, but even before he conceded, it's very clearly the case that his legal teams were constantly 1 or 2 steps behind the Republicans. They just simply were not equipped to engage in the kind of incredibly sophisticated litigations that the Republicans were engaging in. And that is most emphatically not the case right now. He has incredibly experienced legal teams already at the ready. As Andrew pointed out, I mean, there's also a lot of litigation that's going on right now. And, but, I do think at the end of the day, because Biden is an institutionalist, if at the end of the day, he has lost the Electoral College vote, he will recognize that. Mm-hmm. But again, he's not going to do that until every possible avenue of challenge has been exhausted to make sure that we have actually a accurate result.
So a question I guess we ought to ask here is about the Republican Party. Because Trump's one thing, the Republican Party and how they might act in this very uncertain and volatile moment for the United States, can one assume that they will follow his lead? There's a question here which is slightly related to that, which is from Nigel Lake. What role do you think that state governments or even governments of major cities might play if there's a period of instability? And if the president can't be confirmed on the 20th of January, might this role increase? Well, that's a slightly different question. But, will people, the stakes that Trump is playing for, could they actually work against him if people say, actually, this is going too far?
For me?
Yeah, that's for you, Lawrence.
Yeah. So, I think the role of the GOP lawmakers is very important. I really do believe that if Trump loses decisively, and by decisively, I mean, obviously not simply in the popular vote, given the archaic and bizarre way that we elect a president, that is not dispositive. But if he loses decisively in the Electoral College, in swing states, and if that decisive loss is pretty clear pretty soon after the election, again, maybe not November 3rd, but pretty clearly soon thereafter, we start seeing the contours of a pretty decisive victory for Biden, then I do believe that GOP lawmakers will put pressure on Trump to submit to defeat. Now, he's not necessarily going to recognize the legitimacy of his defeat. I just don't think it's in his DNA to do so. I think he will continue to insist that there was fraud, a hoax, corruption, but I think GOP lawmakers will pressure him to kind of hear the music. But again, to kind of return to what I've said earlier, I think the danger is if there really is some lack of clarity about the result, particularly if it turns on narrow margins in swing states, then I could imagine GOP lawmakers, defending his challenges. And the other thing we need to bear in mind is not just other Republican lawmakers, but also important institutional resources that he can call upon within the executive branch itself, and most notably the Department of Justice. Because we've seen, I think very disturbingly, the way in which Bill Barr has emerged, our Attorney General has emerged as his really kind of most effective sword and shield, and the way in which he's willing to use DOJ resources for the purposes of trying to advance Trump's political interests.
So the second part of Nigel Lake's, Andrew, come in. Yeah, do.
I was just going to jump in really quickly on that. I agree with everything Lauren said. I could also see a moment, even when it's still contested, where if GOP lawmakers see that actually the way this is going to break is, even though it's still up in the air, it's going to break against Trump, in order to shore up their own legitimacy, because they've been accused of being Trump's toadies for so long, as a political act, not a legal one or a moral one. They might decide, okay, this is where we, and I could also see that happening with the Supreme Court, where if Barrett is nominated, you have 6 justices, supposedly Trump-friendly justices on the Supreme Court. This could be a perfect way for the Supreme Court to bolster its own legitimacy.
Yeah, can I just
go in?
I want to second exactly that point. A lot of people think that, oh, if it goes to the Supreme Court, it's a foregone conclusion that the court is going to vote in support of Trump. A third of its membership has been appointed by him, nominated by him. But I agree with Andrew. I don't think that's a foregone conclusion at all. And I think it would be a powerful legitimating moment for the court should it actually decide in a way that would surprise many of us in the sense of, not giving let's say, the decision that we might think would be most helpful to Donald Trump.
Yeah, because Barrett kind of uses up, Barrett being appointed, Donald Trump's usefulness for the GOP and for judicial conservatives. It's kind of maxed out now, right? I mean, what more are they going to get from 4 more years of Trump? So
exactly.
So harbor their resources for a better candidate in 4 years' time. That's what you go for. But the second part of Nigel Lake's question was, if a president can't be confirmed on the 20th of January, could we see more role for the states?
Well, you'll have a president confirmed on the 20th of January no matter what. I guess the issue is if, let's say, Congress can't sort through who has actually received an electoral majority, then by the terms of the Presidential Succession Act of 1947, Nancy Pelosi would be sworn in as acting president. But I guess, again, the danger is if, Trump refuses to recognize that. And some of there are, if you've been reading some things that have been circulating in the United States recently in legal circles, you see that there are people who have these questions about whether the Presidential Succession Act of 1947 is as clear-cut as people think it is, whether it's possible that someone like Attorney General Barr could question that Presidential Succession Act. But there'll certainly be someone sworn in. The question is whether it'll be one person or 2 maybe, or.
Yeah, so in some parts of the world, including ones you've come from, Minka, and certainly when I was covering the collapse of the Soviet Union, this is kind of familiar territory, isn't it? Parallel institutions challenging the center, and then that's how you get chaos. I wonder what your thoughts are from what you're hearing.
I don't want to use this sort of comparison, but I often think when I think about less developed democracies, I often think about what I sometimes call Robert Mugabe syndrome, where someone gets into power and they cannot give up that power. And you think, like, why is it you're doing damage to the institutions of the country, you're doing damage to your country, etc. Why are you doing it? And the only explanation is there is so much in it for me. if I were to walk away, I could find myself on the other side of the law. So I can't afford that. I'm not saying that this is happening in the United States, but you can almost see the battle between the institutions and the president. And my only hope is that the institutions have been resilient enough and haven't been corroded sufficiently to allow them to be broken in this transition period. I would worry if we were 2 terms in and there was a possibility of the 3rd term. I would think like, well, they're so corroded, they're so in such a difficult place that they could go in the wrong direction. But my hope is that what you would see in less mature democracies is not going to be repeated in the United States, and there will be those institutions that are flexible enough that they will sort of bounce back, and they will be able to perform what role they're supposed to be performing in a democracy like the United States. And no matter who the challenger is, no matter who the president is or thinks that they are the president, they will be speaking up. And when it comes to GOP, I really hope that the members will feel that they're American first and Republican politicians second, because that is what this moment is calling for. It's calling for seeing way beyond political ideology, politics, and the only sort of, if you want, the only loyalty that one is calling for is the loyalty towards the country that needs to remain peaceful, respecting the institutions and secure at this moment. And I hope that they find that in themselves.
I just want to mention a question that's come in that's to your Robert Mugabe point, which is someone saying, does Trump have any issue with being legally challenged on corruption if he doesn't remain president? I'm thinking about Berlusconi with a similar issue in Italy, which is, you know, it's the idea you everything's at stake here for him, because if you don't stay on, you lose your immunity.
Exactly. So personally invested that you're really fighting for your life and the life of those around you. So there is no better sort of fuel to have at that moment than a personal stake.
So we started talking about internal resiliences, you know, how the Supreme Court might act, how the GOP in certain scenarios might act. But we're very nearly out of time. I wanted to bring us back to the international context of all this. So we've talked about various countries who might see some interest in meddling. It's interesting no one's brought up North Korea. I thought somebody might think they would use, that the president of North Korea might see this as a perfect opportunity to meddle. But the question I really wanted to ask of the panel is how damaging all of this might be if we have this long protracted uncertainty to the international order, and particularly to democracies worldwide. And what lessons might be drawn from it for authoritarian states. Aminka talked earlier about the leading role of the United States as a sort of model in all of this. What do you think, Aminka? How much impact on the rest of the world might it have?
I'm a huge believer in the United States, and a huge believer in the pattern and path that the country sets up. And when President Trump won 4 years ago, I was asked a question, what do you think, what kind of impact might this have upon the rest of the world? And I said, my biggest worry was that little Trumps will start popping up all over the place. And unfortunately, I was right. There are loads of little Trumps, people who take, particularly people of authoritarian kind of mind, they take inspiration from what's happening in the United States and what can be done with a strong will and doubling down on whatever you think is the right course that needs to be taken. My worry would be that it would normalize challenging of democratic system and democratic peaceful transition of power, and the model that the United States set for so many countries around the world. As I say, I grew up looking up to the United States, not fearing the country, but really wanting to live in a country that would emulate everything that the United States stands for in terms of its democracy, in terms of the rule of law, etc. If that were to be brought into question, that could be seen as a legitimate new path in the new way, and therefore replicated elsewhere. And I think there are quite a few candidates.
Lawrence, what do you think about that?
You know, I would basically, I think we're just in heated agreement. I mean, I think I would just second everything that Arminka said. I thought both in the sense of the United States, I think historically has kind of served as a lodestar star for fledgling democracies. And if the United States, you know, if there are fault lines in American democracy which start to really open, that sends out an incredibly dispiriting message, an incredibly destructive message to societies that might be transitioning from some kind of authoritarian past to a more democratic future. And I think exactly as Arminka said, that it also, it sends out some kind of powerful support to the would-be authoritarians around the world. And I just do hope also, as Arminka said, that, you know, we do have a very vibrant democratic history. And we do have many very powerful institutions. And, you know, of course, the deep hope is that those traditions and institutions get us through this, this coming season.
Well, Andrew, what's your view on that?
Well, I'm still shocked. I'm still recovering from Arminka bringing up, you know, using the example of Mugabe and Donald Trump. And that is a true nightmare. And it's what's even more nightmarish is that it's actually, as I was thinking about it, I thought, my God, she's got a point. This is really, we're on really scary terrain here. So, yeah. I mean, one thing I would say is that I don't disagree with Lawrence or Arminka on that. I would say that a lot of those trends were already developing. Could be, you know, whether it's Erdogan, whether it's Orban, whether it's Putin, whether it's Xi. Those authoritarian trends were already, I mean, Trump was kind of riding that wave rather than creating it. This could strengthen that wave, perhaps. The other thing I'd say is that this is a kind of funny way of looking for hope, I guess, is that people now, especially after the last 4 years, but I'd say the last 2 decades, people are kind of used to dysfunction in the American system. And they're not, I don't think people, they certainly aren't now, but even 4 years ago, I'm not sure people were expecting order in American politics. It's so polarized, and it's been so polarized for a while, that I think that people around the world, to a certain extent, they might be very sad about what's happening in North Korea. Bridget, as you rightly brought up, they might be cheering what's happening, but I think people have already kind of baked this uncertainty into the American system. So I'm not sure there's going to be a hard break one way or the other because of what's happening. It's certainly sad in that sense. And then the final thing I'd say is, this is also a kind of depressing note, is that people are used to the US in terms of the international system, international norms, international law. People are used to the US doing what it wants, even when other countries feel that they're doing the wrong thing. And it could be Vietnam, it could be Iraq, it could be all sorts of things in the war on terror. So I think people have kind of, they're watching with concern or maybe with glee, but I don't think there's going to be a shock to the system in that sense. If there is a shock to the system, then the true nightmares that we're talking about have really come to pass. And then we're all in much bigger.
So you're saying if this does descend into a quagmire in the way that Lawrence sketched out, that's more America's loss than the world's loss?
I think it would be everyone's.
Unless there's one of these nightmare scenarios where people start to meddle, which is, as you and Arminka laid out.
Right. I think it would be everyone's loss. But I'm not sure it would necessarily change the complexion of domestic political societies around the world as much as we might fear.
Well, we're out of time. I'm sorry to those of you who sent in questions, I didn't get a chance to put them to the panel. I was trying to think, if you're having a nightmare panel, of course it's going to be quite depressing and gloomy as you walk through the nightmares. I was thinking though, to end on an upbeat note, how we all discussed at length the millennium bug at the end of the 20th century, how it was going to unravel everything, particularly in America, and it didn't. So this is a nightmare, but it isn't the only scenario and way this could play out. And this, and as you were saying, Lawrence, if actually it's, even if it takes a little while to sort out, if it becomes clear, then perhaps the nightmare might get pushed to one side. But we've certainly investigated lots of threads and ways in which it could end up being quite alarming. I very much appreciate your time with us, our panel, Professor Andrew Preston, Professor Lawrence Douglas, and Baroness Arminka Hellich. Don't forget, this has been recorded. It was live streamed, it's recorded. You can look at it again on the Geopolitics website. And there are lots more webinars from the Centre for Geopolitics. Go to the website, get on the mailing list if you'd like to take part in more, listen in, put in your questions. But for now, that's it from me in Cambridge and from all of us. Thank you very much.